Luca Verdun had never belonged. The Sky Hollow Pack tolerated him but never welcomed him. He was an Omega, but instead of being cherished, he was resented, accused of something he never did. His adoptive fathers, Elias and Ren Verdun, had done their best to shield him, but the hatred still bled through in whispers, cold glares, and deliberate isolation. Most Omegas thrived under protection. Luca refused to submit. He walked with his head high, his dark curls framing a sharp face that gave nothing away. His scent, light but laced with defiance, only made alphas wary of him. But today, everything changed. A powerful alpha was coming to Sky Hollow, a man known for his strength and control. Kirin Dreven. The name alone sent shivers down the spines of every pack member. But Luca didn't care. Alphas were all the same. Until the moment their eyes met. Luca felt it before he saw him. A weight in the air. A ripple through his very blood. Then Kirin Dreven stepped into the pack's main hall, his presence a quiet force. He was taller than most, his body powerful yet poised, with storm-gray eyes that locked onto Luca the second he walked in. The connection slammed into Luca, a visceral pull deep in his chest.
No.
His fingers clenched. His breath caught. This wasn't happening. He refused. But Kirin, he saw him. Not the outcast, not the pack's mistake, him. And worse, he was intrigued. The gathering was suffocating, full of alphas and betas vying for Kirin's attention. Luca stayed near the edge of the crowd, forcing himself to be unaffected. Cassian Rourke found him first. "Luca," he murmured, stepping closer. His fingers ghosted over Luca's wrist. "You look bored." Luca smirked. "And you look desperate." Cassian laughed, undeterred. His touch became bolder, his lips close to Luca's ear. He was doing this on purpose. Kirin was watching. A warm breath brushed over Luca's neck. His body tensed, not in fear but in anticipation. Cassian's fingers skimmed his waist, his voice dropping. "Wouldn't it be fun to give our dear Alpha a show?" Luca didn't flinch, but his heart pounded. Then Kirin moved. One moment, Cassian's hands were on him. The next, Luca was being pulled away, rough, firm, undeniable. Luca barely registered the dark hallway before he was pinned. Kirin's body loomed over his, the heat between them a live wire. His fingers dug into Luca's wrist, not painful, just a warning. "You're playing games," Kirin murmured, his voice impossibly low. Luca licked his lips slowly, deliberately.
Oh.
Kirin's gaze dropped to his mouth. Luca knew he was pushing limits. He wanted to. He wanted to see if this alpha would break. But Kirin didn't. He held him there, their breath mixing, heat curling in the space between them. Then, just as Luca thought he might close the gap, Kirin let go. His voice was even. Controlled. "You don't know what you're asking for, Omega." Then he was gone, leaving Luca burning. Luca should have let it go. But Kirin had walked away from him, and that was unacceptable. So the next time they crossed paths, Luca stepped close. Close enough that their hands brushed when he passed. Close enough that Kirin felt him. It started small. Fingers barely touching as they reached for the same glass. A lingering glance across the training field. A smirk when their shoulders collided in the corridor. Kirin's control was ironclad, but Luca could see the cracks. Then, one evening, he pushed too far. Luca found Kirin alone, standing near the pack's training yard. Luca stepped into his space. Too close. Kirin didn't move. A slow, deliberate hand traced the fabric of Kirin's sleeve. Luca watched him, daring him to react. Nothing. So Luca leaned in, his lips nearly brushing Kirin's ear. Nothing to say. Kirin inhaled slowly, deeply. His fingers twitched, as if he wanted to grab Luca and pin him again. Luca smirked. Then he stepped away. And Kirin finally exhaled, long and shaky. The pack was waiting. The elders wanted Kirin to claim Luca as his mate. Luca refused. "I don't belong to anyone," Luca said, voice sharp. The pack murmured. Alphas were possessive. Omegas were supposed to be compliant. Kieran watched him carefully. I won't force you. Cashin laughed, loud enough for all to hear. What's wrong, Driven? Can't handle rejection. Luka expected Kieran to snap, to fight, to prove his dominance. But instead, Kieran leaned down, so close that Luka felt his breath. And then, he whispered, I could have you trembling under me in seconds, little Omega. Luka's breath hitched. Kieran pulled back, his gaze dark, unreadable. But I won't. Luka couldn't move. His entire body burned. Kieran turned away, addressing the pack. I will not claim a mate who does not choose me. The matter is closed. And just like that, he left. Luka's hands clenched into fists. His heart pounded. He had won. So why did it feel like Kieran had? Luka was frustrated. Kieran had walked away. Again. No, not just walked away. He left him burning. That quiet, controlled whisper still echoed in Luka's head. I could have you trembling under me in seconds, little Omega. That wasn't fair. That wasn't allowed. Luka had never met an alpha who resisted this much. They always fell first, always chased, always lost themselves in him. But Kieran wasn't chasing. Fine. Luka would make him break. That night, he found Kieran alone in the packhouse, standing near the large open window that overlooked the forest. His posture was relaxed, but his jaw was tight, like he knew Luka was coming. Luka didn't hesitate. He walked right up behind him, letting his fingers graze the thick muscles of Kieran's back. Not a reaction. So Luka leaned in, his breath warm against Kieran's neck. Do you always run from things you want? Kieran's hand twitched. Luka smirked. He felt that. He pressed closer, his chest just barely brushing Kieran's back. His fingers slid down, 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 tracing along Kieran's arm, slow, teasing, unbearable. Still nothing. So Luka went for the kill. He turned his head, lips just barely touching the sharp edge of Kieran's jaw, whispering against it, You could have had me. But now I'm wondering, can you even handle me? And that was when Kieran snapped. Fast. 1 second Luka was teasing, the next he was pinned. Kieran spun, slamming Luka against the wooden frame of the window, one strong thigh between Luka's legs, caging him. Luka gasped. His body arched instinctively. Kieran was right there. His scent wrapped around Luka like heat, like temptation. Then, fingers on his throat. Gentle, but firm. Luka shivered. His hands gripped Kieran's wrists. You want to play this game? Kieran's voice was dangerously soft. His thumb skimmed over Luka's pulse, feeling it race. You're playing with fire, little Omega. Luka's breath came fast. His fingers tightened on Kieran's wrists. Maybe I like getting burned. Kieran's grip tightened. His knee pressed up, forcing Luka's legs wider. Luka's pulse spiked. Then, Kieran let go. Again. Luka sagged against the window, breathing hard. Frustrated. Desperate. Needing. Kieran just stared down at him, his lips slightly parted, his own breath heavy. His control was slipping. And Luka would make sure next time, it shattered completely. Kieran was losing it. He was a man of discipline. A leader. He didn't fall for stupid games. But Luka, that damned Omega, was unraveling him. He could still feel the way Luka trembled against him. The way his body fit so perfectly against his own. The way his scent, sweet but sharp with defiance, flooded his senses. And the worst part? Luka knew what he was doing. So when Luka walked into the PAX training hall the next morning wearing nothing but a loose, low-cut tunic and leggings that hugged him in all the right places, Kieran snapped. The training dummies suffered first. One punch, completely destroyed. But it wasn't enough. Luka noticed, smirked, and then he stretched. Right there. Right in front of Kieran. Back arched, arms overhead, his tunic lifting just enough to show smooth skin, a hint of his lower stomach, teasing, taunting, ruthless. Kieran turned fast. If he didn't leave now, He was going to do something very, very stupid. But Luca's voice stopped him cold. Running again? Kieran froze. Slowly, he turned back. Luca was watching him, head tilted, lips curved in a slow, knowing smile. I think you're scared, Luca whispered. His voice, so soft, so dangerous. Kieran moved before he could think. 1 step. 2. 3. Luca's back hit the training wall. Kieran was in front of him, towering over him, pressing into him. Luca's breath caught. His pupils blown wide. Kieran's fingers curled around Luca's chin, tilting his face up. Scared. Kieran murmured, voice dark. You think I'm scared of you? Luca licked his lips, deliberate. I think you're scared of what happens if you give in. Kieran leaned closer, closer, their lips almost touching, so close Luca could feel the heat. Then, just as Luca leaned up to finally take what he wanted, Kieran pulled away. Again. Luca almost screamed. But Kieran just smirked, his voice a low promise. Keep pushing, little Omega. See what happens. And then he left. Luca's nails dug into his palms. His body burned. He was going to make Kieran Driven break. Luca had reached his limit. He had tried everything, touches, teasing, temptation. And Kieran was holding on. Too well. Fine. If Kieran wanted to play control, Luca would show him who really had control. The next time they were alone, Luca didn't wait. No teasing. No slow build. He walked right up to Kieran, grabbed him by the collar, and yanked him down. Their lips crashed. Hard. Desperate. Unstoppable. Kieran froze, for half a second. Then he devoured him. A hand fisted in Luca's hair, pulling him closer, deeper, until Luca was gasping against his lips, until there was no space left between them. Heat. Raw, blazing heat. Luca had won. And he was never letting go. Luca had expected a fight. What he hadn't expected was Kieran dragging him into his room and slamming the door shut. 1 second, he was teasing Kieran, pushing his control to its limits. The next, he was pinned against the wall, breath stolen, chest rising and falling as Kieran loomed over him, dark eyes burning. You wanted my attention, little Omega? You have it now. Luca shivered. This wasn't the controlled alpha who kept pulling away. This was the predator. Luca's lips parted, but before he could say anything, Kieran moved. A hand slid up Luca's throat, tilting his head back. A thumb traced over his racing pulse. Tell me, was it worth it? Kieran murmured, voice low, lips brushing against Luca's jaw. Pushing me this far? Luca's hands clenched against Kieran's shoulders. His body reacted before his mind could process. Heat. Electricity. He swallowed, breath shaky. Kieran felt it. Luca tried to speak, but Kieran was too close, too intense, too much. A rough exhale against his ear. That's what I thought. And then, just like that, he was gone. Again. Luca let out a breathless, furious laugh. This alpha was going to drive him insane. Fine. If Kieran wanted to play this game, then Luca would make sure he lost. The tension was unbearable. For the next few days, Luca and Kieran danced around each other like fire and gasoline. The pack noticed. The way Kieran's eyes followed Luca. The way Luca deliberately stood too close whenever Kieran was in the room. Something was happening. And then, the pack meeting happened. The council had called an emergency discussion. A rival alpha was challenging Skyclaw Pack's territory. Kieran, as the leader, had to be impenetrable. Except Luca saw it, the flicker of stress. The weight Kieran carried alone. And he hated it. So that night, Luca did something reckless. He went to Kieran's room. Knocked. Waited. When the door opened, Kieran looked tired. Guarded. But when his gaze landed on Luca, something softened, just barely. What are you doing here? Kieran's voice was low, unreadable. Luca stepped in. Close. Let me take care of you. The words were out before he could stop them. Kieran stiffened. Something in his gaze flickered, raw, vulnerable. And then, finally, he let go. Kieran never let people touch him first. He was alpha. He was supposed to be in control. But when Luca's fingers brushed against his chest, slow and careful, tracing the scars across his skin, Kieran let him. Luca was gentle. Not teasing. Not playing a game. Just there. "You don't have to do this," Kieran murmured. But Luca's touch didn't stop. "I want to." Heat coiled in Kieran's stomach. He had spent so long denying this, fighting this. But now, with Luca so close, his scent wrapping around him, there was no running anymore. And then Luca did something that shattered him. He pressed his forehead against Kieran's chest, his breath warm, his fingers curled into Kieran's sides, grounding him. Not demanding. Not teasing. Just holding him. And Kieran broke. His arms wrapped around Luca instinctively. His fingers dug into Luca's back, pulling him close. For the first time in years, he let someone hold him. And it was Luca. The next morning, something had changed. Kieran was no longer pulling away. He didn't hide the way his hand brushed against Luca's as they walked through the packhouse. He didn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on him, openly, possessively. The pack noticed. And Luca thrived. He tested Kieran at every turn, running his fingers over Kieran's arm during breakfast, whispering in his ear just to feel him shiver. But this time, Kieran didn't retreat. This time, when Luca pressed against him, fingers playing along the hem of Kieran's shirt, Kieran grabbed his wrist. His voice was low, rough. "If you want this, Luca, stop running. Stop teasing. Just be mine." Luca's breath hitched. His heart pounded. This was it. No more games. No more running. And so, Luca stepped closer, tilted his head up, and finally, he kissed him. Deep, slow, unstoppable. Kieran groaned against his lips, his hands tightening around Luca's waist, pulling him flush against him. This was real. And neither of them were turning back. The territory war was looming. But Kieran had something more important to deal with first. Luca. His mate. His everything. For the first time in years, Kieran wasn't fighting alone. And Luca was ready to stand beside him. But danger was coming. And when the rival pack made their move, Luca and Kieran's bond would be tested in ways they never expected. The morning after their first real kiss, everything had changed. Luca had expected Kieran to pull away, to hide behind duty, to pretend it hadn't happened. But Kieran didn't. Instead, he stood beside Luca openly, unapologetically. When they walked through the packhouse, his hand brushed against Luca's. At breakfast, his gaze lingered too long. The pack noticed. And Luca burned with it. Because now, the game had shifted. Kieran wasn't just reacting to him anymore. He was watching, waiting, hunting. And Luca was so damn ready to be caught. But they had bigger problems. The rival Alpha was moving. They had 1 week before war arrived on their doorstep. And Kieran? He was about to make damn sure Luca knew exactly where he belonged before that happened. The tension between them had been smothering all day. Luca had pushed, tested, tempted. Every lingering touch, every hushed whisper. Kieran had taken it, absorbed it, and given nothing in return. Until now. Because the second they were alone in Kieran's room, everything exploded. Kieran slammed the door shut. His eyes were dark, predatory. Luca barely had a second to breathe before Kieran had him against the wall, his hands caging him in. "You keep pushing me, Luca," Kieran murmured, voice rough, his breath hot against Luca's lips. "Are you ready for what happens when I stop holding back?" Luca's heart thundered. His lips parted. Kieran's hand tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet his gaze. "This is your last chance." Kieran's fingers tightened just slightly around Luca's throat, not enough to hurt, just enough to make him feel it. "Tell me to stop." Luca's breath hitched. He should be scared. But all he felt was heat. Want. The need to burn in Kieran's fire. So instead of answering, he leaned in, just enough for their lips to brush. Make me yours, Alpha. The moment the words left Luca's mouth, Kieran snapped. Their lips crashed together, fierce, devouring, unstoppable. Kieran's hands were everywhere, gripping Luca's waist, sliding under his shirt, pulling him impossibly closer. Luca moaned into his mouth, fingers digging into Kieran's shoulders. And when Kieran lifted him effortlessly, carrying him toward the bed, Luca knew. There was no turning back. When Luca woke up the next morning, he felt everything. Every touch, every lingering press of fingers against skin, every whisper of breath against his neck. And most of all, he felt Kieran. The Alpha was half asleep beside him, his arm thrown possessively over Luca's waist, holding him close. Luca could barely believe it. Because last night had been everything. Not just raw, not just consuming, but something deeper, something undeniable. And yet, the moment the sun rose, reality came crashing back. A knock on the door. A voice. Alpha, the council needs you. Now. Kieran tensed against him. Luca felt the shift immediately. The warmth, gone. The moment, over. And when Kieran pulled away, his face unreadable, his back rigid, Luca realized something. Kieran wasn't ready for this to be real. The next few days were hell. Kieran went cold. Distant. Not cruel. Not unkind. Just a gone. Like last night had never happened. Luca hated it. He wanted to shake Kieran, demand answers, demand to know if he regretted it. But then, the attack happened. The rival Alpha had moved faster than expected. By the time they realized it, the enemy wolves were already inside their borders. The battle was brutal. Blood, claws, chaos, and then Luca was surrounded. Alone. Outnumbered. Cornered. A warrior lunged at him. And suddenly, Kieran was there. Feral. Unstoppable. Deadly. He tore through their enemies like they were nothing, his eyes glowing with a rage Luca had never seen before. When the last enemy fell, Kieran turned to Luca, chest heaving, eyes burning. And before Luca could say a word, Kieran grabbed him. His hands fisted in Luca's shirt, pulling him close, forehead pressing against his. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," Kieran snarled, voice shaking. Luca barely had time to respond before Kieran's lips crashed against his, hungry, desperate, raw. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a claim. A vow. A promise. Mine. After the battle, everything changed. Kieran didn't hide anymore. He didn't pull away. If anything, he was worse. Every time Luca so much as breathed, Kieran was there. A touch. A glance. A possessive hand at the small of his back. And the teasing. Oh, Luca was suffering. Kieran had flipped the game on him. Every time they were alone, Kieran would push, just enough. A hand on Luca's throat. A whisper against his ear. "I should punish you for scaring me, Omega." Luca shivered. But then, Kieran would walk away. And Luca was losing his damn mind. But then, Kieran gave him a choice. "Stay with me, Luca. Not as my responsibility. Not as my packmate. As my mate." Luca froze. This wasn't a game anymore. This was everything. And for the first time in his life, Luca realized. He didn't want to run anymore. Luca had made his choice. Or at least, he thought he had. But standing in Kieran's room, feeling the Alpha's presence like a storm about to break, he wasn't sure anymore. "Say it again," Kieran murmured, voice rough. Luca swallowed. The weight of what he was about to do pressed against his ribs. "I want this," he whispered. Kieran's expression darkened. "You want me." Luca exhaled sharply. That wasn't fair. Kieran already knew the answer. But he wanted to hear it. To own it. So Luca lifted his chin, his voice steady despite the way his body burned. "Yes, Kieran. I want you." The instant the words left his mouth, Kieran moved. Luca barely had time to react before he was slammed against the wall, a rough hand gripping his jaw. Then prove it. And Luka did. That night, there was no hesitation. No holding back. It was fire and need, teeth and hands, a hunger that consumed everything in its path. When Kieran finally collapsed beside him, breathing ragged, fingers still wrapped in Luka's hair, Luka realized something terrifying. He wasn't just Kieran's. Kieran was his. The days after that night were different. Kieran didn't pull away. If anything, he was worse. He had always been possessive, dominant, a force of nature. But now he touched Luka constantly. A hand at the nape of his neck. A thumb tracing his wrist. A grip at his waist when they passed through crowded halls. And the way he looked at him, like he'd already decided. Luka was his. And Luka liked it too much. But the pack had noticed. The Omega is making you weak, one of the elders warned. Kieran's jaw tightened. Then I suggest you adjust to your new alpha, because I am not letting him go. Luka heard every word. And it should have been enough. But then, the attack came. And this time, Luka was the target. The scent of blood filled the air. Not Kieran's. Luka's. Kieran saw red. The moment he found Luka, wounded, cornered, shaking but still fighting. He lost himself. The enemy never stood a chance. Luka watched, breathless, as Kieran ripped through them. No hesitation. No mercy. Only raw, terrifying rage. And when the last body hit the ground, Kieran turned to him, eyes dark, chest heaving. "Luka," he breathed. His voice shook. Luka swallowed hard, blood staining his skin. "I'm okay." Kieran didn't answer. He just moved. 1 second, Luka was standing. The next, he was pinned against a tree, Kieran's mouth devouring his. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was feral, desperate, consuming. "I almost lost you," Kieran whispered, voice raw. His fingers dug into Luka's hips. "Do you have any idea what that would have done to me?" Luka couldn't breathe. Because he knew. Kieran hadn't just been fighting for him. He had been fighting because of him. Because if Luka had died, Kieran would have burned the world down. The pack was in chaos. The attack had been too precise. Someone had betrayed them. And Luka had a target on his back. He sat at the edge of Kieran's bed, staring at his reflection, a deep wound stitched across his side. Kieran was pacing the room like a caged wolf, fury rolling off him in waves. "You're not leaving my sight again," he growled. Luka's fingers tightened around the sheets. "Kieran, I can't stay locked up like some fragile thing." Kieran was in front of him in a second, gripping his jaw, forcing their eyes to meet. "You think this is about you being weak?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Luka, if something happens to you..." He broke off. Luka swallowed hard. Because this wasn't just about protection. This was fear. Real, gut-wrenching fear. Kieran had lost so much. And now, he was terrified of losing Luka, too. So Luka made a choice. He leaned in, pressing his lips against Kieran's, slow, deep, grounding. "I'm not leaving you," he whispered. And this time, Kieran kissed him like he believed it. The days that followed were unsteady. The traitor still lurked in the shadows. The war still loomed on the horizon. But in the midst of the chaos, Kieran and Luka only fell deeper. They moved together like they had always been meant to. And at night, when everything else fell away, they burned. Luka had never been kissed like this. Never been touched like he was something sacred. And when Kieran finally whispered his name against his skin, voice wrecked and raw, Luka knew. They had crossed a line there was no coming back from. They were bound. By fate. By blood. By something deeper than both. And now, nothing could tear them apart. Except the war coming straight for them. Luka knew something was wrong the moment he woke up. The air was too still. The bed beside him was cold. And then, pain. A sharp, searing pain at the base of his neck. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like stone. His vision blurred, darkness creeping at the edges, but he forced himself to focus. Something was in his system. Poison. Or worse, suppression drugs. His heart pounded. No. No, no, no. His instincts screamed run, fight, escape. But his body wouldn't obey. And then, the shadows moved. A familiar voice, low and cold. "He won't come for you, Luca." The voice of a man Luca had trusted. The traitor. He tried to snarl, to fight, to do anything. But the last thing he heard was the sound of chains locking around his wrists. And then, darkness. Kieran felt it the second Luca was gone. Not just a suspicion. A wound. A deep, gut-wrenching wound that tore through his chest like claws. Find him. The entire pack flinched at his tone. The rage in his voice wasn't just anger. It was a promise of war. And when they found the scent, when they followed it to the traitor's den, Kieran didn't wait. He didn't plan. He tore through them. No words. No mercy. Only death. And when he finally reached Luca, bound, weak, eyes barely open, something inside him snapped. The traitor had 1 second to beg for his life. It wasn't enough. When Kieran lifted Luca into his arms, his body was shaking. Luca. A weak, shattered breath. Kieran. Kieran swallowed hard. I'm here. I've got you. I swear on my life, I'm never letting you go. Luca woke up in Kieran's bed. Safe. Warm. But not okay. His body ached. His mind raced. The war was here. And worse, the pack had been weakened. Kieran sat beside him, eyes dark, shoulders tense. He hadn't left his side. We move tonight, he said. We end this. Luca's fingers trembled. I want to fight. Kieran's jaw tightened. You almost died. And I won't let them take me again. Silence. And then, Kieran's lips crashed into his. Not gentle. Not soft. Desperate. Possessive. Claiming. Then we fight together. The battlefield was chaos. Blood. Fire. Death. Luca moved like he had never moved before. The bond between him and Kieran burned brighter than the moon. They fought side by side, back to back. And then, the final blow. The enemy Alpha charged. Luca barely had time to react before Kieran threw himself in the way. A sickening crack. A pained growl. Kieran went down. And Luca? Luca lost himself. The power inside him exploded. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be an Omega. Not weak. Not fragile. But a force of nature. And when he ripped out the enemy's throat, the war was over. But at what cost? Kieran's breathing was shallow. Blood soaked the ground beneath him. Luca refused to let go. Stay with me, he whispered. Stay, Kieran. Please. A weak, tired smile. You boss me around too much, Luca. Shut up and live. Kieran coughed, but he held on. And when the healers finally arrived, Luca broke. Because for the first time, he realized what true fear was. Not war. Not death. But losing the man who had become his whole damn world. Kieran survived. But the scars remained. On his skin. On his soul. Luca never left his side. Not when he woke up in pain. Not when nightmares gripped him at night. Not when the weight of leadership threatened to crush him. You're stuck with me, Luca whispered one night, fingers tracing Kieran's scars. Kieran caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his wrist. Good. Because he wouldn't survive losing him. Not again. It started where it had all begun. Under the stars. Under the same moon that had once been their curse. Luca stood before Kieran, bare, vulnerable. Say it. Kieran's voice was rough. Say you're mine. Luca smiled. I've always been yours. The bond burned between them. And when Kieran kissed him, slow, deep, final, Luca knew. This wasn't just love. This was fate. And this time, nothing would take it away.